All right, good morning, everyone. So we are right on 9 a.m. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Hayley McGill, and thank you for attending our webinar today, Analytics Maturity and Company Performance / ROI. So today's webinar is brought to you by the International Institute for Analytics, otherwise known as IAA. So today's webinar will be hosted by our CEO, Jack Phillips, and our Vice President of our Analytics Assessment Service line, David Alice. So just to give you a little bit of background on IAA, we are the industry's leading source of expertise for companies making the transition to data-driven decision-making and advanced analytics. So we offer 4 unbiased, client-oriented services designed to help organizations across the entire analytics lifecycle, from ideation through strategy and planning, all the way to operationalization. So before I hand over to our speakers, I just did want to take a moment to cover a few housekeeping items. So we will be accepting questions throughout the presentation, so you can pop them in the chat box and our speakers will get to them at the end of the presentation. We will also be recording this webinar, so if you do have to step away at any point, that's okay. You will find it in your inbox tomorrow. And finally, if you did want to know a little bit more about our 4 service lines, you can pop over to our website, which is iianalytics.com/services, and you can find all of the information that you'll need there. So with all of that said, I'm going to hand over to Jack.
Haley, thanks very much, and hello to everybody, wherever you may be around the world. Really excited to be here today. We're going to explore something that we spend all of our time thinking about, which is that link between analytics maturity and capability and overall company performance. So one of the reasons that we want to cover this topic right now is, first of all, we get so many of you, our research clients, asking us similar questions around how do I justify the investment that I'm proposing we as an enterprise make in analytics? How do I build greater support for my analytics program? And then how do I get these business stakeholders to buy in on support and investment in overall analytics capabilities? So we want to take a look at that question from a couple of different, really 2 perspectives. First, we see increasingly now a set of minimum capabilities. We might call them table stakes capabilities that don't necessarily have an explicit link to a return on investment, but instead the opposite. If you are not keeping up, you literally risk oblivion. You literally risk your own survival. So it is, in a sense, the cost of doing business. Then above that are the strategic capabilities that generate a true competitive advantage, and we see in our data support that really leads to superior company performance. That's the zone that most of our research clients want to be in. Everyone wants to know, how do we continue to compete on analytics? And then finally, we will take a minute, of course, to try to put in context the COVID-19 crisis and talk a little bit about some of the strategic capabilities that companies have that have helped them weather this unexpected external event, and a couple of others as well. So from an agenda perspective, beginning just simply with the simple question of why analytics maturity? Why is it that we're talking about this? And again, this is something that we cover day to day. And then really 3 major areas here: maturity across industries, analytics maturity and company performance, that connection. And then we've got a new piece of research that we've been working hard on, which is a canvas or a survey of the growing body of external research, both academic and market research, that supports many of the theses that we've been creating. And we'll finish with what we think are the right steps for you all to take out in the market, the key takeaways and the next steps. So that's our agenda. I am really excited to have David Alice with me here today to walk us through all of our findings and our research.
All right. Thank you, Jack, for the introduction. Hello to everybody out there. Jack and I are certainly excited to actually socially distanced to be in the same room for once over the last several months. So It's great to be here. One of the things we always talk about just foundationally is why analytics maturity matters. Why over the last 10 years is this becoming increasingly important? Over the last several months, people have obviously been distracted by COVID-19. There's still a series of underlying macro trends that are emerging right now and coming to fruition that all drive the need for greater analytics maturity. Of course, the one we talked about before is the increasing sophistication and complexity of the analytics technology stack. This is enabling new capabilities and new opportunities across a wide spectrum of use cases, technology areas, ways to interact with data and analytics. And it's basically arming a whole series of companies to go ahead and become more analytically driven. As a result of this increasingly diverse ecosystem, the investment in big data and analytics continues to increase. Of course, this then drives the need to justify the investment in ROI that's happening. I think one of the things we've seen in the marketplace is many companies are struggling to quantify that, and perhaps today we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. The other major trend out there is the increasing use and adoption of cloud infrastructure to support enterprise IT and then ultimately analytics. Still think one of the best way to look at this is just the continued growth of Amazon Web Services from both a quarterly revenue perspective and an operating income perspective. And if you look at this, looking at 2020, there should be a $40+ billion operation within itself. So the increasing availability of analytics tools, the ability to basically scale those tools in a cloud environment that doesn't have upfront capital costs, is leading to increased industry disruption. Again, another source we've referenced in the past is CB Insights. Here's just their recent landscape on AI 100. Companies that are using AI to either fundamentally alter the infrastructure that supports analytics, or the functional areas that need analytics, or actually specific industries. And this has a play, for any traditional organization out there, they're likely to have a digital native-like competitor entering the space. And if you look further out, there's other trends that are emerging, things that would have a broad impact across a number of industries. The application of AI for genetic engineering, the use of IoT or autonomous vehicles to change delivery models. So again, you're seeing a lot of innovation in the space that's then ultimately leading to increased industry disruption. And finally, we're seeing a quantitative impact on how long companies are around based on this happening, right? So again, CB Insights looking at the average lifespan of companies on the S&P 500, from 61 years back in 1955 to 17 years today. And that's, again, just an impact from that disruption. So you think about these large macro trends, they're really just driving that table stakes need that Jack talked about to increase analytics maturity. Companies have to get better at using analytics and driving analytics across the enterprise in order to be successful. Which really gets to the next piece of our discussion today, which is analytics maturity across industries. So again, when IIA looks at analytics maturity, we leverage two industry standard frameworks. The first framework is the 5 stages of analytics maturity, originally introduced by co-founder Tom Davenport in the book Competing on Analytics, and then updated in the 10-year anniversary edition. And the key thing I think about the 5 stages of analytics maturity is it just is going to characterize how data and analytics are used within an organization based on stage. So it starts an analytical beginner, which even though they might have reporting or data, the organization is generally not data-driven. Migrates to localized analytics, which is where most traditional organizations reside. Here you might have data and analytics used at a sophisticated level, but it might be isolated to a silo or a business function or a particular area. And there's not a consistent usage pattern or a consistent way of developing analytics across the enterprise. Stage 3, analytical aspirations, are where organizations begin to see the value of analytics and then try to drive it from an enterprise perspective. So it's definitely a transitional stage with respect to the use of analytics. And then stage 4 and stage 5 is where you see the greater use and adoption of analytics across all elements of the organization. As we explore this day to day, it's really important to remember that most traditional organizations are somewhere in localized analytics, and the very best organizations, including companies like Amazon, Google, et cetera, tend to be high stage 4. So even those companies in our measurement framework, don't go to stage 5 as an enterprise as a whole. So if you think about the 5 stages as characterizing how organizations use analytics, the Delta Plus framework really describes the capabilities that need to be created in order to drive analytics maturity higher. The core Delta model came out at Analytics at Work, again from IIA co-founder Tom Davenport and also faculty member Bob Morrison and Jeannie Harris. Really characterized 5 key components that organizations need to drive. data, which is the breadth, integration, quality of data across the enterprise. Enterprise, which is there a consistent, thought out approach to managing analytics across the enterprise to help drive that consistency. Another key factor is leadership, which we see all the time in our assessment work, which across all the leadership spectrum, executives, middle-level managers, et cetera, is there a passion and commitment to using analytics. Targets, the process in which analytics are driven into production and managed into production. And then analysts ultimately reflecting the skills of the different analytics people, from the professional data scientists that produce analytics to amateurs that might be manipulating data in Excel to drive a business outcome. Those core 5 components we define as enterprise analytics maturity. There were 2 new components added in the 10-year anniversary edition of Competing on Analytics, which is then the Delta Plus model. Those type 2 components are analytics techniques, which we look at as the diversity and sophistication of the analytics methods that are put to use for business cases. So can you combine multiple techniques or using more sophisticated techniques like AI and machine learning? And then technology is the supporting data and technology infrastructure used to create analytics. And I think the key thing here is how is that platform and technology oriented? Is it oriented towards data availability or to restricting data access? And then what's the overall velocity that platform can perform? How flexible is it? How quickly can new data sources be added and new technology be added? And we really look at that as the domain of the analytics organization and the IT organization that supports that capability. So you have enterprise maturity, which is the broad use of analytics, and then the analytics organization capability, which are what are just the raw data science analytics capability that the organization might have. So we looked at our data across the the spectrum of companies. From our work with thousands of companies at this point over the last 10 years, most companies are still struggling to get out of that stage 2 localized analytics. Again, doesn't mean they don't have sophisticated analytics usage, but they'll have sections of the company that aren't data driven, or they'll struggle to actually get that capability into widespread use and adoption. And we've done up over 90 full assessments at this point. And on that range, the range of scores we've seen is a low of 1.25 to a high of 3.72. And the median, again, across those 90 companies is about 2.25. One of the things we've also done, and we've talked about this before, is to proactively go out and collect the analytics maturity data from organizations that we've identified as leaders, either based on feedback from our expert network or from a market position or just known capabilities that we've seen. We call that market leader index. It's a completely different set of companies. It's up over 140 now, approaching 150. And here we've seen a low score of 1.73 to a high score of 4.94. And that's a data set that we regularly update, by going out to research panels, by using other approaches to basically collect the same assessment survey data we use on a full assessment, and just take that data and compile it into indices that can be used for tracking performance and for goal setting.
Dave, let me just take a quick break because the questions are fantastic that have been coming in here. A couple I think I want to take after we get through the next section. So a common one we get, are there any companies in stage 5? Let's hold that, right? Because I think we are going to talk about as we get into industries. Another good question here is, I think I understand it. What are your thoughts on an enterprise repository for end user consumption? And would that evolve depending on the stage of analytics maturity? So I think we're getting into self-serve, and we certainly, I mean, you've got thoughts here. How does that differ between, say, a 2 and a high 4?
Yeah, so I think, we'll certainly talk about the first question about stage 5 companies. I mean, one of the things we've seen, I think, in the data is as you go into stage 4, you build up a certain set of capabilities that change your perspective on what competing on analytics is. So you reorient, you think about it, Amazon is oriented around competing against Google and Facebook, right? So their idea of what competitive advantage looks like is certainly different than a more traditional organization. So that's something that certainly comes into play. And even with traditional companies that get to stage 4, and we do have a number that have gotten to stage 4, in our measurements, they're still probably orienting more around the digital native landscape. So it's kind of like an awakening as you go through stage 3 as what type of capabilities you can unlock within an organization. On the second question, I think we'll talk about this a little later, but we certainly see these 5 characteristics that really define companies that are in high stage 3 and stage 4. One of them is data mastery. I think, how you get the data mastery might depend on your orientation. So for example, I think a lot of digital native companies are much more oriented around open APIs, open interfaces to data repositories, but certainly having that widespread, consistent view of data is particularly important to drive maturity. And we'll actually talk a little bit about how to get out of stage 2 with respect to those capabilities later in the webinar. But those are great questions.
And as we introduce this next section, you'll love this one. This is a perfect tee up. Has your ROI analyses progressed to include the impact to shareholder value for publicly funded organizations? Hold that question because it's a great one, and that's the holy grail. That's what we're trying to get close to.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on that a little later. So again, that market leader data includes a number of kind of blue chip companies that everyone will be familiar with. We specifically target digital native companies or companies that might be disrupting segments like a Tesla in automotive or Airbnb in travel and leisure. We've gone out and at this point collected well over 1,000 surveys. This allows us to create a series of indices, right? So we'll take those surveys, we'll combine them into indices, and just to get a relative understanding of where analytics maturity lies across those different industries. So here's just a sample of the 30 or 40 indices that we've created. And then a couple major segments like financial services, retail, manufacturing, where there might be lots of asymmetrical competition. We've created basically composite indexes that show kind of best-in-class performance, where you might have a bank that's also competing against wealth management that might also competing against an insurance company, for the same type of customer. And then we take those data and we assemble them in the indices. So if you again look at digital native, which really includes the big the FANG players, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, you have a score in the mid-4s with respect to where they put analytics maturity. Digital native segment again looks at those companies that are just targeting specific verticals but have emerged and are leveraging the infrastructure provided by Amazon, Google, and the cloud. The companies like Airbnb, Uber, et cetera, that are in that segment. Then there are 4 kind of key segments from the traditional organizational world, the traditional company world, that are also high stage 3 and overall enterprise maturity. Financial services, no surprise, just given the early adoption of analytics and data back into the 70s. Consumer brands that are tending to compete more and more in the digital sphere for customers, et cetera, have high levels of maturity. Pharma and medical device companies do, and then the general retailers, Walmart's, Target, et cetera, also have high levels of maturity. And again, remember, these don't represent the average, where the average company is. Again, even in financial services, when we've done full assessments, we see a lot of stage 2 companies that are struggling to get there. This more reflects where the leaders are. So if you're in one of these segments, what you want to think about is what target do I need to set in order to have a competitive advantage? And maybe in financial services, table stakes, competition level might be high stage 2, but I have to get a full stage higher in order to actually unlock competitive advantage. So again, these would be targets for high performance. A whole series of industries that are in the low stage 3, migrating up the analytics curve with respect to competitive advantage. And then you still have a number of industries where even high stage 2, reasonably robust capabilities at the functional silo level would generate a competitive advantage in that segment. And then, we also then will do some individual calculations and just try to get general ranges across different segments. So, here you can see even, in digital native or digital native segment, there's some pretty large ranges. The large range of manufacturing is generally, process-oriented manufacturers at the bottom, more complex system-level manufacturers at the top. Certainly healthcare insurance, there's a wide spectrum between, even among leaders in analytics maturity, and that certainly comes into play. So that's kind of the core data that we've collected, and shown over the last several years as we built that database. So this next section is some work we've done to basically take that data and compare it against a whole series of financial performance metrics, investment performance metrics, and company performance metrics. This is a follow-up to a study I think we originally released in 2018. With this follow-up, we're going to look at, the analytics maturity data from 123 companies within the 140 plus that we have in our market leader data set. And then, as part of that 123, there's 109 of those companies that were publicly traded with 10 years of financial data that we were able to look at and do some analysis on. The lower left box here just talks about the market leader segments that we have, that we kind of look at with respect to analytics maturity. Since we're going to be talking about financial data, I think it's also important to look at the S&P 500 and how our market leaders index compares to that. So generally, especially on the top, is reasonably in line. And again, remember, S&P 500 is based on market capitalization weight, not necessarily percentage of the economy weight. But again, you can see we're maybe a little biased on information technology, discretionary, consumer discretionary section, financial section, but generally in line with the S&P 500 as we look through this data. And ultimately, we'll summarize this at the end, but we compared over 60 different, kind of metrics across a number of different spectrums to look at this data. The first piece is financial performance. So this is just looking at our stage 2 companies that are in the market leaders data, our stage 3 companies, and our stage 4 companies, and then seeing how they did from a financial financial performance perspective, really revenue growth over the last 3, 5, and 10 years, and then operating income growth over the last 3, 5, and 10 years. And here, a pretty stark advantage to those companies that are in stage 4, although even stage 3 companies do better than stage 2 companies. This particular graph includes our digital native companies. Even if you take those out, the high-end performance on stage 4 goes down a little, but you're still, double what a stage 3 company would typically do from operating income growth and a revenue growth perspective. Next, we'll look at investment return. So again, looking at 5-year return and 10-year return into the same groupings. Again, the stage 4 companies do particularly well. I think it's actually interesting to look at competition against segment. A lot of the stage 2 and low stage 3 companies, for example, in our area are retailers or more disruptive industries. Versus some of our higher performing companies that have a higher use of analytics are more stable from that perspective. But even on a 5-year return or 10-year return, getting a 1 or 2% improvement in performance versus the segment is pretty significant. So again, reasonably supportive of the concept that you can move from stage 2 to stage 4, stage 2 being kind of table stakes level investment to stage 4 being competitive advantage. You're going to see that from a financial return perspective and from an investment return perspective. Now, the harder thing might be, because you might have a company that's in a particularly competitive industry or having external factors that are there, what other ways can we look at quantifying company performance? So one of the things we've looked at and culled through a little bit is just a list of kind of company lists of high-performing companies, whether it be by brand, by innovation, or just by overall, market perspective. So again, looking at the Fortune World's Most Admired Companies, you can see from the companies we have in our database that are on the list, they average a higher analytics maturity score than the companies that aren't on the list. And the correlation coefficient in that relationship is reasonably positive. The other list we looked at, one thing I'll note on the Fortune Most Admired list is there's actually a score that they use for calculating the overall rank. That score is based on things like innovation, people management, use of corporate assets, quality of management, et cetera. And the analytics maturity score is also correlated to how high that score is within the most admired companies list. We'll also look at Forbes, which has another matrix looking at innovation in companies. And again, those companies on the list scored higher than those that weren't on the list. Likewise, Boston Consulting Group has the most innovative company list. Again, similar type of a difference between on the list and off the list is maintained. The other thing we looked at is actually how many times did a company show up on that list since its existence, from 2005 to 2019. And again, that was heavily, at a high correlation to overall analytics maturity. Similarly, looking at Forbes' best brand list, similar break of being on the list versus off the list as far as analytics maturity, and also a correlation, on relative rank to analytics maturity score. And then finally, we looked at data for brand finance, again, looking at brand value as its correlated analytics maturity score, and then the ranking order on the list, where they showed up on the list relative to analytics maturity score. Those were also correlated. So again, just trying to look at some, maybe qualitative or softer metrics on company performance, overall market position, and how analytics maturity might play into it. And again, across the board, reasonably positive association between those two. And just summarizing our data, and we're putting together a research brief that'll be out in the next week or two on this. Again, looking across 68 different metrics, 57 of them showed a positive association, which we looked at as being a correlation coefficient of at least 0.2 or higher, and 11 of them were basically neutral, right? So they fell below that 0.2 threshold. And again, largely in line with what we saw in 2017, even though we've got 2 or 3 more years of financial data, or it's 2018, 2 more years of financial data since we did that, and we expanded the number of companies, I think, from 70-something to 109. So that data we feel, pretty positive about, right? From an enterprise perspective, you're building analytics maturity, and you can get to the high stage 3, high stage 4 type of maturity level. You'll see it in overall operational performance.
Okay, let me again, a number of great questions coming in here, Dave, but that I before we go to the next section, one we get a lot, which is how do you essentially prove or attribute causality in these numbers, right? This is a question often asked by buyers of analytics. What ROI can I precisely attribute to this new analytics spend? Can you prove to me, essentially, that it will make this return? This is a difficult research question, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think ultimately, like to get, you and I were talking about this before, right? Kind of that holy grail of firm lock on ROI. We probably ultimately need to drive a much larger and consistent data set around analytics maturity and take that information on a regular basis. And ultimately, that's something that we would strive to do. I think the other thing that I think makes it tricky and where enterprises have some difficulty in adjusting to this is that the path from a technique or use case that might drive competitive advantage to it being table stakes is so fast. A lot of times you're inside 2 or 3 years that that ROI component is difficult for organizations to calculate, right? Because you have something that you think, I'm going to do this and get a competitive advantage. By the time on some typical timeline that's put in place, it's no longer driving that advantage, right? Everybody else has already armed themselves with a similar technique, and now it's basically something I have to have competitive advantage. So I would say, we can't for certainty say, yes, this is 100% guaranteed to link. I will say that it's overwhelmingly positive, right? There wasn't anything that was opposite correlated, right? There was no information that said, hey, if I was more analytically mature, I actually did worse in something versus a stage 2 company. And Jack and I also talked about, well, is this, the counter thing could be happening, right? As organizations that already have an advantage in the marketplace are basically doubling down on analytics to drive that advantage higher. So either way, I think there's a strong relationship to that. They've either leveraged analytics to achieve their market position or maintain their market position, or they're going to use analytics to extend, that market position. And that really gets us a good segue in our next topic too, which is, okay, this is our take on it, and we have a probably unique take with respect to how we look at analytics maturity, because we take survey data, we run it through our own maturity model that we are constantly evolving and making sure it accurately reflects analytics maturity to come up with our scores. But there's also third-party research that's done with a variety of different techniques that we'll highlight a couple of those pieces in a second that also support that approach.
But I think we would conclude that as we go across this, we're not seeing the word causation across much of the research. We would guide you to stick with correlation, highly correlated. Causation could put you in trouble with management if you can, because there is no guarantee. But
definitely in the preponderance of the evidence, civil lawsuit, you'll win it.
Yeah,
might not be able to convict the person with it, but the data is pretty strong. And then I think the big thing we always look at too, which I think, and we've thought about what's a better way to frame this, is that, is anyone really talking about ROI on using email or ROI on using mobile devices at this point, right? Because everyone's spent a tremendous amount of money to enable those capabilities. They've migrated from something that might give you a competitive advantage as a first mover to something you have to have. I think the trick in analytics is to actually articulate that and kind of show that either through benchmarking or really thorough understanding of what other people are doing in the market to say, hey, listen, we have to have this core set of capabilities in place if we're going to be successful. So why don't we do a little bit of walk through some of the existing research. So as Jack alluded to, we're interested in the subject. We want to look at how other people are viewing it. And there's actually a lot of research out there, right? There's research that basically starts in the 1960s around decision support systems. There's research around the 1990s that looks at business intelligence as that emerged. And then, of course, there's a whole body of research that starts around analytics coming to the forefront in the 2000s. So obviously, we'll actually talk a little bit about the thousands of papers that are out there, both from a market research perspective and an academic research perspective that cover these areas. But we'll highlight a couple of both market research and academic research that's come out over the last 10 years. And as part of our canvassing, we probably looked at 100 papers at this point and have done kind of more detailed review and analysis on 25, just trying to coalesce about what's available and what's out there. And if you do think about this other research, right, there's kind of two general types of research that are out there. There's market research, right, that is typically driven by, kind of a consultant group that's doing it or a vendor that's doing it or kind of your mainstream business publications. HBR, for example, tends to fall on both sides of this discussion depending on who's looking at the information. And then, of course, you have academic studies that tend to show up in peer-reviewed research journals. And the other thing to consider here, too, is you generally have these two buckets, and there's not necessarily a lot of crossover between them. So you have kind of the general strategic use and value of analytics, very similar to what the data that we went through, that Jack and I went through here, that we've compiled. But then you also have very specific analytic method, technique, use case specific analytics around supply chain or marketing or customer, et cetera, that would look at a specific narrow technique and see how it might perform from an ROI basis. I think one thing that there's certain topic areas that are missing we'll talk about, but also really the art around operationalization, right? How to actually go from getting things into production and getting things used is a gap that's out in the research. These are some pieces we'll quickly talk through. Of course, we'll start with the granddaddy of them all, competing on analytics, back in 2007 and then updated in 2017. And we'll go through a combination of market research and then academic research in what it showed. And of course, competing on analytics was started as an HBR article, evolved into a book. You made some specific claims about the correlation between analytics maturity and 5-year compound annual revenue rates, and then also indicated that high performers from a company performance perspective were 50 times more likely to use analytics. And that's from the original research that Tom and Jeannie Harris did. I think it was involved with surveying well over 30 different companies in detailed interviews. And there was also an IBM study that looked at the organizations, that high performers were 5 times more likely to use analytics than low performers, was also a basis for some of that research. So again, since the book's so widely out there, I think it's important, to look at the foundational idea that you could use analytics to drive business value and what they looked at. A second, article out there looking at the link between big data and analytics and company performance. Basically looked at over 330 companies and determined that the top 1/3 of those companies, that were more analytically inclined or in their data-driven decision making were 5% more productive and 6% more profitable than the other 2/3. And they did do some analysis to basically factor out things like labor, capital, purchase service, et cetera, to basically get that baseline around data-driven decision making. And again, that article is publicly available, so it's a good reference, despite the fact that that's kind of the foundational period of the use of analytics. So another one that's interesting to look at, first came out in 2013, but was updated in 2017 with a digital advantage. This was from work done by Capgemini and a number of different people, including McAfee, who worked on the first article. The key thing here is that it really looked at this concept of digital maturity. So looked at surveys from 390 companies and 157 detailed interviews, to build this concept of digital maturity. One of the reasons why we like this article is their concept of digital maturity is very similar to our concept of analytics maturity. So for example, it looks at visual intensity, which is how much is a company invested in technology that enables customer engagement and improvement to internal operations that really drive analytics use cases. This is very similar in my mind to the data component, the enterprise component, and the targets component of the Delta model. And then it also looks at the transformational management intensity, basically the vision, guidance, engagement of leadership, which again kind of directly relates to the cultural aspects that we capture in the L, or the leadership component of Delta. And the key thing here, if you look at their model between customer-facing processes and operational processes, you can see that analytics resides at the hub of those activities. So it's critically important there. And as they broke companies into kind of 4 different groups: beginners, conservatives, what they call fashionistas, and also the digerati, the people that actually used analytics. What they found is the top performers of digerati had 9% higher revenue, 26% higher profitability, and a 12% higher market cap. So again, very much in line with, if you look at the data here from a digital maturity perspective and the data that we saw in our analytics maturity, very similar, type of performance metrics. And again, really good, I think that it focuses on the cultural aspects that we see as critical, right? It's the soft skills are the hard things to do in any of these transformations. Again, publicly available to look at from that perspective. So the other thing we actually get a lot of questions of, and this is where I would say there's probably not as much research as you'd ultimately like that really tries to quantify at the project level or the initiative level what kind of ROI you can achieve. But one that was out there, published in 2018 from McKinsey, did actually look at 100 specific project cases and what type of returns they were able to generate, whether it be from top line growth or from bottom line cost reduction. So if you look at most of the top line growth, it falls within the 1% to 2% type of gain, right? A 2% lift in sales or 1% increase in margin. They have a couple of specific use cases, right, where at least they have some backup data about a good case, good implementation of a case, for example, of churn prevention can yield a 1.5 lift in revenue. Likewise, on the cost reduction side, some pretty common use cases that we see all the time, and what maybe target returns are for those type of things. I do think something like on predictive maintenance is important to realize. You're not talking about your entire maintenance budget. I think they're just talking about your specific call center costs, et cetera. But if you're at least doing, thinking about projects in these areas and maybe benchmarks for, okay, what type of return do I want to get on a particular project, this has some good data that I would say generally is not widely available in the market. And again, at least off of 100 projected cases. So switching, so those last two were both generally what we consider market research, right? I mean, they're from kind of the big 5 consulting groups, looking at analytics and seeing the importance of it. If you go into the academic research, there are a variety of different research papers out there. This one that was published in the Journal of Management Information Systems, was particularly interesting in that it showed that overall industries that have live, which I think we like the fact that they actually said systems that were in production, live big data and analytics assets were associated with an increase of 4.1% in productivity. And then that increase actually, if you're in an IT-intensive industry or a competitive industry, that gain in productivity was higher. Curiously enough, and there was over 70% of the participants either classified themselves as in one or two of those segments. If you weren't in a competitive segment, you basically didn't see that gain. So they did attribute some of that to just having a critical mass of talent, et cetera, investment to make that gain possible. But this would be somewhat similar to what we see in our market leader segment data, where you have high performing industries where overall you're seeing that performance, and then low performing industries where you don't necessarily see the interest in analytics. So we're industries that are more localized and don't have a national competitive landscape or an international competitive landscape, tend not to be as analytically mature. but it was based off of 814 companies, so a pretty rich data set that they used, and that looked at their own metrics and measurement around big data and analytics platforms, and then company performance over a 6-year period from 2008 to 2014. Another, again, kind of highlighting the growth and interest in this space from a research perspective. The British Journal of Management recently had an issue that was completely focused on big data and firm performance. So a number of interesting articles there, and they highlight at a high level that you've got new things like machine learning and AI that are going to change the value creation, even though you still have problems around big data. And that a lot of the thesis and thinking about it might certainly change with these technologies as they come into play. One particularly interesting way to look at it is they did a much more extensive canvas than we've looked at, which is really looking at the overall, this is one of the articles in this issue, the history and evolution and future of big data and analytics, where they just basically did an analysis of all the papers that were out there. And a couple of key conclusions they made. They identified 324 primary research documents, and then they had over 1,252 secondary documents, right, which were basically cited in at least 2 of the primary research documents. And they did a canvas of 47 experts in this area to get their perspectives on some of the research. And there's a couple of interesting conclusions you can make. You can obviously see on the chart on the left that you are seeing more effort. I think this is one of the questions that came in, why isn't there this hard ROI? Well, part of the problem is there hasn't been, it's not a new enough discipline where you've got that rich body of research yet, but you're starting to see that increase. I think the other conclusion they made, and it's interesting to look at, is, well, where is the cluster of research today? And you can draw a couple of conclusions from where those clusters exist. Number one, what areas actually are there lots of activities? Has there been lots of consideration of the ROI where people are reasonably mature? And then what might be coming down the future? So, for example, large clusters around just foundational strategy, big data and analytics, around marketing analytics, around customer analytics, and around supply chain analytics, right? So if you think about marketing, customer, and supply chain, the fact that there's a rich body of research around the ROI and the relationship between investment and performance, you'll indicate those areas are going to be generally more widespread and mature. Likewise, there's areas where there's not a lot of information. For example, in areas like HR, and legal, in procurement, M&A activity, public sector, public administration activity, facility management. Here you don't see the same bodies of research, right? So you can either look at it that A, application of analytics in those areas isn't as defined yet, or B, if I have a model or some application there, maybe there's an opportunity to get competitive advantage because there hasn't been as much research done in that space. So Jack alluded to, we're pulling this together in an asset that's more usable, but here's just a summary of kind of the papers we've talked about, both from what they're looking at and some of the key conclusions. So again, it's kind of back to the preponderance of the evidence, right? I think all these things you'll put together, you'll help build the case and support the case that investments in analytics capability and investments in maturity ultimately drive higher company performance.
David, again, let me take a quick break here, a couple of good lead-in questions to our final section here, which is, how does the company actually use the maturity model to drive improvements? In other words, comment on where we should focus our time, what level of investment and corporate behavior is required to drive improvement. So perfect lead-up question to this final section. And then if we have time at the end, I'll come back to among all these questions, a really interesting one, which is, how does executive intuitive awareness factor into your analytics maturity model? Let's hold that because we've got some good stuff. Maybe we come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, really quick on that first question, I think we certainly have our framework and models for measuring analytics maturity. I will say, from our experience, and some surprising things is, I think the biggest advantage of using any of those frameworks is really to prioritize what you're going to work on. versus just purely the benchmarking data. I mean, it's always good to know where you are relative to another company, but to really understand for your specific company, what are your specific challenges that need to overcome. And for example, one of the things we've seen in our full assessments with like in companies that are in stage 2, is they might all have and they probably do all have some kind of data issue, but the root cause of that data issue can vary from company to company. So if you really want to identify, like, well, why are we struggling with this particular data issue? You need to have some detailed understanding of the company and whether it's the legacy of technical debt that's developed, the acquisitions, the emphasis of management, what's made that company successful. Identifying that root cause is critically important. So on that first question, I think it's really about, we would like to focus on prioritization and actionable insights when we do an assessment, not just coming up with where a score in an organization is. And I think we'll hit the second question here as we go through some of these final points. Just looking at what we've gone through today and the data out there, I mean, I think there would be a couple, 5 key takeaways that we'd want to look at. The first, again, you have this series of macro trends driving a need for increased levels of analytics maturity across all industries. And that's really that's the bar for table stake analytics capabilities, and analytics maturity is rising rapidly. So this is the one thing I think that's hard for organizations to quantify and to use in their planning process, right? Is that there's basically this ever-increasing slope of capabilities that I have to be on in order to advance my overall analytics maturity. And that's one thing we've certainly seen in doing assessments, where you'll have a company that improves from an effectiveness perspective from one year to another year, or improves in a capability perspective from one year to another year. But the demand by the business stakeholders and the interest in analytics by the business stakeholders just outstrips the ability to deliver, right? It increases at a faster rate than what the organization is set up to deliver. Another key thing from our data is that there's definitely a positive association with overall analytics maturity and company performance, that you've got a growing body of academic and market research that supports the links, and it's at a variety of different levels between analytics maturity, again, going to that digital maturity model around capability, around investment and company performance. So again, the growing set of proof that quantifies that. And finally, enterprises need to understand and measure analytics maturity and develop programs for advancing it, which is another critical thing, right? You have to understand where you are across these different spectrums, and then you have to realize what are the things you need to work on in order to improve. So one other topic I think to consider now is we've talked about these macro trend influences, then everybody's got competitive and market influences that are driving different things. One thing that seems to be happening, and analytics also plays a role in this, right, is that disruptive events seem to occur with increasing regularity. This is a chart we pulled out from the S&P 500 that looks at these market shocks and what happened and what those impacts are. And you can see, as the initial COVID-19 market shock, which is essentially recovered. But these are just examples of disruption that either accelerate trends or basically elevate the need to use analytics. And on top of these, you could start to plot out, some other things that might lead to similar type of shocks. We're certainly seeing a higher frequency in major weather events, more areas of countries that are trying to adjust to climate change. It's affecting agriculture, real estate development, et cetera. And you're also maybe on a breakthrough of some fundamental technology changes that might alter how a whole variety of systems work, like autonomous vehicles or AI-driven genetic engineering. And we're certainly seeing this in working with customers on COVID-19, right? So, and the impact on analytics. One of the things here, again, a perspective on different markets that are being influenced by analytics. I'm sure if you're in something like retail or restaurant and dining, you're fully aware of the impact. But if you actually look at where that impact is happening, personnel, operations, supply chain, revenue, all areas where analytics is swinging the difference. And if you certainly look at different industries and different segments, and if you're looking at some of the earnings reports, you're seeing, those companies that are more analytically capable are adjusting to the complete disconnect nature of this event. So, for example, Chipotle restaurants, if you follow the earnings reports, have done reasonably well. They made a huge investment, basically mobile and analytically driven ordering last year, that's paying its fate this year. And of course, people know Amazon, Netflix, the streaming companies, for example, have all done well and adjusted to this area. There's starting to be some, articles about, well, how is this impacting, how analytics are used and how people are investing in it. And I certainly think from our customer base, we've seen an increased interest in business stakeholders, right? And I think some of this comes down to you think about what's the competition to data-driven decision-making in a lot of organizations. It's experiential or gut-based decision-making. And there's validity to experiential or gut-based decision-making to the extent that a trend of events is relatively normal and you can draw on that experience. Like COVID-19 is something that nobody has experience in, and a lot of the organizations we work with are overwhelmed with data requests because now I think those stakeholders that maybe used experience realize that, okay, we have to be more data-driven. So the other thing, again, if you look at that summary data, we talk about most companies being in stage 2. So stage 3 starts to get you in performance increases. What are some of the prerequisites for advancing to stage 3? This is from a blog we published last month. But basically, what we see is there's kind of 6 things that need to happen, right? And this is based on our experience working with customers and on data on the assessment side. Where you think about if I'm a stage 2 company, are there tells that I can look at that'll help me advance? If I'm a stage 2 company, that'll help me advance to stage 3. One thing we see, and this gets back to the question that came in, what is one thing I need to have? Well, in our experience, you need to have a high-level executive outside the analytics organization driving for better use of analytics across the enterprise. We don't have a case of a company making the transition to stage 3 without that, right? It can't be purely within the analytics organization. From an education perspective and a use perspective, the enterprise stakeholders, the business stakeholders have to have an inherent understanding of the difference between reporting and BI and advanced analytics and what that means for their business. You have to have an effective data management and governance program that has been proven to work at least across a couple of use cases, right? So again, the key thing here is effectiveness, and does this stuff work, and is it of the proper weight, et cetera, that it can be used in a production environment. So again, if you have that, you don't have to have that everywhere across the enterprise, right? But if you have that built and you're in a process that what we call is customer driven, you can start moving into stage 3. There has to be some consistency in how analytics is used by business stakeholders to drive business across the enterprise. Some of this could come down to just having a couple key metrics where everybody agrees, right? This is customer churn rate. This is lifetime value of the customer. If you have 3 or 4 organizations that can all look at that metric the same way, you're at least making progress in advancing towards stage 3, even if you might still have silos and localized analytics going on. The 5th thing is that there has to be some consistency in how analytics are actually developed and deployed across the enterprise. Again, if you're completely functional in your analytics production, everybody's doing their own thing, you're actually not on this framework going to move forward to stage 3. And finally, the velocity of organization improvement must be faster than general marketplace advancements in analytics. And this is probably the one thing that organizations struggle with the most is just getting on the treadmill that's happening in a lot of these markets right now with respect to the capabilities and how quickly I need to put new data sources on, new tools on, et cetera, in order to be successful. So you can use these as just kind of tea leaves, is basically if I can see these 6 things, get meaningful progress in here, I can elevate my organization out of stage 2 and into stage 3. The other thing we talked about then is like, well, what makes a stage 4 company different? What type of capabilities do I have to advance to stage 4? Drew Smith and I did a webinar, I think back in Q1, that talked a little bit about this. We have an ebook available on the website, but as we've looked at the data and we've looked at these companies, there's really 5 things that make a difference, right? That these companies have that you don't see in a stage 2 or maybe even a stage 3 company. One is leadership. This, again, not just a single executive, but generally all the business stakeholders and all the executives are bought in to the idea that the organization needs to get better. There's what we call flexible and dynamic IT architectures. So one way to look at this is velocity. System velocity on data sources and tools is actually a consideration, a business consideration for what's being built on the IT side. There's some level of what we call data mastery. It doesn't mean data is perfect or completely locked down, et cetera, but that, generally data is available and it's of reasonable quality, or at least reasonably defined to understand where the quality gaps might be. And again, I think this is as much culture and philosophy as the technology. You could do the universal data store that allows self-service analytics. You could also have a universal API architecture that basically forces this, across the enterprise. The fourth key thing we see is that the analytics organizations apply what we call product thinking to analytics. So they view their business stakeholders as customers. They view their analytics work as a product that's delivered to customers, and they leverage a lot of product management and customer management techniques in order to make sure analytics are adopted. So you've got to educate the business stakeholders about how to use analytics, but we see too many organizations that are in denial about how much they actually have to move their processes and what they do towards the business stakeholders, right? Because at the end of the day, your business stakeholders are who you have to service. So you have to think about how you adopt what you're building to them, more than have them, come all the way to you. And I think the final thing is then having what we call an innovation-oriented culture. And the key, and there's lots of different ways to look at it. There's lots of interesting articles out there. I think the biggest thing is if people understand when they're doing a high-risk, high-reward investment on analytics, do they understand, the trade-off between risk and return, and what happens to the people that are involved in that project if that project doesn't work out. I think advanced organizations look at that team as being more valuable, right? They understand what the risk was, what the reward was, that they actually learned a lot. I think organizations that struggle with innovation would basically penalize that team. They were in a failure, therefore that idea doesn't work, therefore we don't use it, and we don't ever really learn from what happens. And that's probably at least from my background in primarily early growth stage companies, et cetera, that perspective on learning is dramatically different, and you certainly see that in digital native companies about how they view market expertise and market learning. I think with that, we can wrap up. Jack, if we have some time for Q&A.
We do, yeah. Take a breath. That is fantastic. Let me swing back to this executive intuitive awareness factor. I hope we've answered that well, because in the prior slide, let's go back one, Dave, real quickly. Just note, number one here at the stage 4 level is leadership. If you go all the way back to, you can push it back, back over to the Delta model. Remember, L of Delta stands for leadership. So absolutely, this concept of how strong your leaders are, whether they're inside the analytics group or, more importantly, outside, is a critical element of how we think about analytics maturity.
The one thing I note on, the only other thing I note on there is that, if you're lucky, right, you either have an executive that sees that or becomes that champion. A lot of organizations have to work their way to that point, right, which is, again, one of the things we stress when we work with companies is really understanding that prioritization process and making sure you're building a approach and program that helps build momentum, right? So that's not only done delivering projects that deliver business value, but that I'm also actively thinking about how I communicate that, how I circulate that with executives, and build that from the ground up, which can be done.
Yeah. Push forward one more slide. A good question here, which is, how do I know what my score is, right? Or I say, go toward the end, David. And just to underscore, we at IIA, obviously, we pride ourselves, we think, on being the world leader in assessing your analytics capability. So you see analytics maturity assessments here. We hope that you'll use our framework, that you'll call us if you're interested in knowing where your company is on that industry index that David showed earlier. And then, David, you'll love this one. The last question is, and I know I want to give Haley enough time to wrap us up here. In your opinion, which industry segment do you think is most untapped, right, which has the most headroom, the most running room with respect to maturity growth when it comes to analytics?
I would say that most, if you just look at most relative to the size, it would have to be on the healthcare side, right? I think there's a tremendous amount of activity in that space. So that's certainly one, to look at, from that perspective. And I think that bears out. I think we've seen a lot of these. We've been working with a lot of healthcare providers. You see them laying in some of these capabilities in place to respond to this pandemic, which is great, right? And we've talked to people that see that change in the business stakeholder. But if you actually look at it in VC investment, the VCs, I do think, right or wrong, you can say good things and bad things about VC, but they do have a structured approach to where they're placing their investments. And that's often based on market opportunity and the competitive state of the players in that market around things like analytics and AI. If you look there, obviously, that you've got, healthcare is a major area of investment, and then financial services is a major area of investment. Just I think more than anything because of the size of the market, and certainly you've got entrenched players.
Yeah.
But even like you see a lot of consumer products, right? Because of the breakdown in how you interact with customers, et cetera, where there's investment in place. But I'll probably go healthcare, financial services, as being the two biggest areas. Yeah. Even though they're at the opposite end of the spectrums, right? Which is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Haley, if you're there, you can take us home. Obviously, a lot of questions about how do I get these slides. So, Haley, you can answer that for folks.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We did record this webinar and we will be sending it out tomorrow along with the slides. So you'll find that in your inbox around midday, so keep your eye out. And again, if you wanted to find out more about our services, head over to our website. So that's iianalytics.com/services. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.